Hello, Tooth and Corners. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about buying a dental practice. We're going to be talking about a lot of different pieces of that puzzle, but the thing that we're not going to do today is we're not going to go into some boring math. We're not going to go into some very subjective visions of what quantitative value is based off of some mathematical formula that creates some number that gives you how much a dental practice is worth. There's lots of content that's out there that covers those pieces of the puzzle. We're going to talk a lot about that today. We may have another episode that does that because I obviously enjoy that part of the process. Just the feeling of putting a mathematical number around something that has a bit of a qualitative subjective element is really fun to me. Like just saying, okay, it's worth this much. Like that's really fun to get to see and get to do. But that's not what today's about. Today's about making the decision to buy. It's teaching you guys some misconceptions about buying a dental practice, because I see this happen. Some misconceptions about buying a dental practice that I see happen a lot. We're going to be talking about what to really look for when you do find a practice that you could potentially purchase. And finally, we're going to be talking about what failing with an acquisition really looks like. This is all based off of the 400 offices we help with being their CPAs, which of those 400 offices, a very large percentage of those practices purchased their practice. So buckle up, it's going to be a fun ride. Okay, first we're going to talk about the age-old question of should you buy a dental practice or should you do a startup dental practice? A lot of people are going to probably disagree with me here, but I'll say that acquiring a dental practice has a higher success rate than doing a startup from scratch. And the reason is because you're removing a lot of the unknown variables from the equation. But that's only if you define success as maintaining some type of status quo or maintaining some kind of profit. Because again, you're removing some of the unknown variables about your situation. But if you define success differently, as an example to that, let's say that you're wanting to turn an existing practice that's a small practice into some type of a mega practice, then honestly, that's a really, really, really different question that we're trying to answer whenever it comes down to getting into this practice ownership thing. That's really, 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 really hard to do. And I tend to see my startups be able to go from that like startup phase to mega practice easier a lot of times than going from buying a practice doing say $700,000-$800,000 a year up into that mega practice. It's a very, very, very different situation. So when you're trying to figure out like, do I want to buy a dental practice or do I want to do a startup dental practice? That's really, really important to look at. So if you're looking for like some type of a standardization or you're trying to find like a pilot practice to start with, then buying a dental practice for the first one is not a bad idea. It's something that can work out for you. You can get in there and start seeing how it looks. But if you're trying to build something completely new, then doing a startup actually may be the best route for you. There's a lot of people out there in the industry that will say that acquisitions are the 100% best bet. And I don't necessarily agree with them. It just depends on what you're looking for out of this thing. Everybody gets into business, into their career, into their practice ownership and the way that they want to help in different ways. And so who are we to define success as some, dollar number at the bottom? That is the easiest way to keep score, obviously. And as a person who loves to keep score, that's a great way to do it. But you can define success differently based off of what you're wanting out of that situation. So yes, deciding to buy a dental practice does typically maintain profit. It does typically provide a more stable version of income post-transaction than doing a startup. So for those reasons, it's easier to give advice to tell people you should go buy a dental practice. There are other factors that fall into play as well if you're deciding to buy or to do a startup. The most common of those pieces of the puzzle is where you live. And what I mean by that is where you live is really, really, really important. If you don't live in a place where you want to do business, where you want to own a dental practice, then that can be a negative. So in other words, if you want to live an hour away from where you find the opportunity for a practice, and you're not going to live at the place where the practice is, that can be a pretty big pitfall. People don't really talk about that very much, but some of the most success we see from our clients is them being a staple of their community, them being active in their community and getting people to come into their practice. I mean, it makes logical sense. If most successful dental practices come from internal referrals from their patient base growing and things like that, then naturally, if you are physically located and active in the community of where your practice is, then you're going to create more connections. Those connections turn into referrals, and it just becomes a lot better of a process. So I actually think the factor of, are you going to live where this practice is a big piece of it. If you don't want to live where that practice is, I would say that would lean me towards saying you shouldn't buy that practice in that area. Other pieces of that in terms of like where the practice is located. So let's say that you want to live an hour away and there's just not any practices that are available. Should you do a startup in that area? That's a tough one too. It depends on your demographics. There's a company called Denographics that does some good dental demographic studies for people that are out there to try and figure out. When you look at demographics, I won't get too far into this because I promise it wouldn't be a nerdy episode, but the old adage is 2,000 to 1 population to dentist ratio, but it's a little bit more complex than that, especially if you have a specialty. It's also dependent on like how big the practices are in your area, because if you are in an area, let's say, use easy math, say there's 10,000 people in the area and there's 5 dentists that are there, well, that's fine. But what if one of those practices has 5 providers there? Well, then that all of a sudden changes the equation quite a bit, because now you have 9 dentists for that 10,000. Now you're at like a 1,200 to 1 ratio. So if you're in that city and you've got, there's 10,000 people here, then should you do that startup in that area since none of those practices are for sale? That's a little bit rougher of a thing to go about. That could be a very challenging practice to start. Now, what happens in those smaller towns like that, the reality is a 10,000 person town typically has a lot of places around it that can have the potential for patients to come in. You can grow off of it, but it can be tough sledding for a while. The biggest success we seem to see with that is in areas that are growing. So it's not just the dentist to population ratio, it's also what's happening to the population in that town as well. So that can be a bit challenging. So what do you do if there's no practices to buy and you're looking to buy in the area that you are? Well, you've got to consider moving, and you've got to make that decision for you and your family and for what you want out of it. And it's a hard discussion to have, which is probably the reason a lot of people don't talk about that very much. But it is a really important piece of the puzzle. Understand that you need to be considering living wherever your practice is going to be. So let's say that you've decided, hey, I can't do a startup in this area. I'm going to go buy a dental practice. Let's talk about some misconceptions about buying dental practices. The first misconception that I tell people about is that just because it was done in the past doesn't mean it will be done in the future. The overwhelming thought is usually like, oh, I look at this practice, this dentist was doing this much, this is how much I'm going to be able to make off of this practice. And that is not always the case. To give you some examples of this, I will just say that different dentists are better at different things. Some dentists can produce more than others. Some people are better at describing and getting people to say yes to treatment plans. Some dentists are just able to see more patients in a day. And that usually is not reflected in a practice valuation, in the purchase of a practice, or in just general conversations when people talk about purchasing dental practices. So the first thing that's a big misconception that I tell people that are looking to buy a practice is to pay attention to the type of production being completed by the selling dentist. So a very quick kind of litmus test on this is look at how many active patients are in that practice. Look at how many people this practice is claiming to have in their patient base. Now, every dentist, every broker, every practice management software has a different definition of what an active patient is. I generally say, hey, your active patient count is the people you've seen in the last 12 to 18 months. You may not have that data in front of you. You may not be able to pull that information out. A very quick way to do a litmus test of that is to look at how many prophies were done in this practice. Obviously, if it's not a practice that offers hygiene, that'd be harder to do. But you look at the number of prophies that have been done in that practice. You then divide that number by 2 because you assume that most of those prophies were people that came twice in a year. And that gives you an understanding of about how many patients are in the hygiene protocol. And then why is that important? In most dental practices, not all, by any form or fashion, maybe I'd say 60, 70% of practices, the hygiene protocol is the more consistent of the ways to get patients to come through. It's a fairly good, again, litmus test, kind of proxy calculation of how many active patients are in this practice. We'll say that there was 1,000 prophies that were done last year, code D111 110 in terms of the procedure mix. And there was 1,000 that were done. That 1,000 divided by 2 is 500. That means that at a minimum, this hygiene protocol has 500 patients that we know are active patients. Now, the math behind that after that, there's more to do, is generally speaking, a good running hygiene protocol will have somewhere between 60 to 80% of their patients in the hygiene protocol. So what that means is that if we have 500 patients in the hygiene protocol, we have a math equation now that we can calculate a general idea of a range of how many actual active patients are in this practice. So I'm not going to do the math just out of nowhere here, but you take 500 patients divided by 60%. So 500 divided by 0.6 is 833. And you'd also take the 80% range, which is 500 divided by 0.8, which is 625. So that practice that had 1,000 prophies likely has somewhere between 625 to 850 patients that are active. You can pretty much bank on them coming in after you take over that practice if you were to purchase it. So that tells you how many active patients they have. And then you look at how much revenue, how much in collections and production this practice is bringing in. You can look at either number, you look at production, or you can look at collections. It depends on which one you're more familiar with in your personal situation. Let's say this practice has 850 patients, and this practice does $1 million a year in revenue. Well, that means $1 million divided by 850, it's $1,176 per patient per year is being collected in this practice. That means that you have to be able to produce, if it's $1 million in production, then you have to produce it. If it's $1 million in deposits into the bank account that's on the profit and loss, then that's collections. If they've got like a 30% write-off, that means that there's a higher number than that than collections. So $1,176 per patient is what you have to be able to produce or collect, depending on which number you calculated, in order to take that practice over. That is not something that every person can replicate. Very commonly, we'll see a practice that has $1 million in revenue and they'll have 2,000 patients. So the second big misconception that I tell people about is that the collections is all that matters, or EBITDA is all that matters, or any type of financial factor is all that matters. I actually believe active patients is one of the most important numbers to look at when you're searching for that great practice. And the reason is, let's just continue with the example I gave earlier of the 850 patients. If that practice has 850 patients and that practice is generating $1 million a year in collections, awesome. But if that practice has 850 patients and it's generating $400,000 a year in collections, well, those two practices have the same number of patients. One's probably more profitable than the other, but the other one likely has a lot of opportunity comparatively. So the misconception number 2 is saying that the EBITDA or the collections or the ABCDFG are the most important things that matter. I say one of the most important things that matters is your ability to produce dentistry. I know that sounds crazy whenever you're looking at buying a dental practice, but your ability to produce directly will reflect your success rate after you purchase that practice. So if you're coming straight out of dental school, which a lot of people do, they'll come straight out of dental school. Well, I'll say a lot. There's a significant number of people that go through dental school, they get right out of school, they go about dental practice, and they succeed or fail. Not everybody's built that way to be able to do that. There are some great ones that have been able to do that, but it can be a tough thing to find. Some of the most successful acquisitions I've seen happen are because a really great dentist that could do a lot of production and they could take care of patients in a really comprehensive manner went in and they bought a practice that had 1,500 to 2,000 patients. That practice was generating $700,000 to $800,000 a year in revenue. And that dentist immediately turned that practice into like a $2 million practice, right? So a practice was generating $700,000 to $800,000 a year in revenue. They bought it for say $600,000 to $700,000. And then literally a year or two later, that practice is doing $2 million a year in revenue. They didn't really gain any more new patients. They just were producing more per patient because that doctor was so good at doing that treatment for those patients and the older doctor just didn't. And so what happened there, that means that new dentist is making a lot of money from that dental practice, cash flowing a whole lot of money and equity value. So they bought that thing for $700,000 to $800,000. If you look at a traditional way of valuing that practice, the practice is now worth $1.5 to $2 million or something like that because he's generating so much more in revenue. Now, that's because of the traditional way that we calculate and value dental practices. But if you keep the advice going of what I said is it depends. This is the reason this is a misconception. This is like an odd mental loop that happens in dentistry is even though he took that up to that value, you could find a buyer for that amount because that's what the market allows. But that practice is less likely to succeed in the new dentist hands unless that new doctor coming in is as good as the old doctor that was going out. So again, big misconceptions there is that the number is the important thing. In reality, the type of production being done is a really important thing. So what to really look for? Obviously, I already said one, which is active patient counts. Another thing that I would say that is really important to look for is the staff. How good is the staff? Depending on the dynamics at play with this practice being sold, you may not even get a chance to look at the staff, which is tough. It can be difficult, but you can generally make an assumption that what happened prior in terms of activity that in the future will act that way as well. If you've taken the variables of production and patient count out of the picture, you can assume that that person's still going to come to work. You can assume that person's going to be able to do the work and things like that. Now, are they going to be able to be put up to speed with all the things that you want to do in that practice? Maybe not. But generally speaking, you can make an assumption that if there was a hygienist there that's been there for 5 years, that once you take over, they'll likely at least perform it to the level they were performing in the past. Now, the coachability of that person, the management style for that person are not things you can typically predict. If you're going to go along well with that person, things like that. But at the end of the day, it is important. That would be something that I would tell you to look at whenever you're buying a dental practice or being at least aware of. Maybe I should rephrase that and say, one of the things you should really look for is to be understanding of how you're going to manage after you acquire. Because I think that's a piece that a lot of people don't think a whole lot about. And there's not a whole lot of information that's out there about that. But if you're one of the people listening to this podcast, I think that you're probably doing your homework. So that's great. Just be aware, leadership is something that is really important and really difficult to pinpoint of how to tell people to do that or how to lead team members. So when you're looking at these practices to purchase, the experience of the team that is there is important. So if you are looking to acquire a practice and you see that everybody's been there for less than a year, that's a little bit of a red flag if you've never under practiced before and you're not really confident in your management skills or leadership skills. Because you're going to get there and no one's really going to know the game. No one's really going to know how to do the next thing. They're all going to be kind of blending together their prior experiences to come up with what the day should be like. So that is something that's a little bit of a red flag. Another thing that I'll say is new patient counts. So if we use that same example before, 850 patients for the practice, and you get in there and you see that there's just not very many new patients at all, then that can be a bit concerning. One of the hardest things to do in dental practices is to create new patient flow where there was none prior. It's very common that I hear people say, oh, the old dentist just wasn't doing any marketing, and that's the reason he didn't get any new patients. And that's a possibility, but the reality is that marketing for dental patients is actually really, really complex. I've got a whole episode on this, so I'm not going to rehash the whole thing, but what works for some won't work for others. And it may be the reason that practice is not getting new patients in is because more along the lines of like, it's just a saturated market and the demographic doesn't respond well to marketing. So that's also a piece of it. So keep an eye out on new patient flow and make sure that whatever number is there, you're aware of. I said I wouldn't talk too much about math, but I'll talk about this component. But if that practice has 850 patients, generally a dentist can handle somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 patients, depending on the type of practice you're going to run. So if this practice is 850 patients currently, and you can handle 1,500, and the new patient flow is 5 new patients a month, it's going to take forever to get to 1,500 patients at that rate of new patients, to 60 new patients a year. And you're trying to get another 650 patients into the practice. It's going to take you 11 years just to get that many new patients through the doors, not even counting attrition and all the things that go along with that. So you're going to have to turn that 5 new patients a month into like 30 to 40 to 50 to even get to that goal in any reasonable amount of time. And that's not easy to do. That's underplayed about how hard it is to turn that marketing faucet on and actually have it give you results. It's really easy to turn the market faucet on. It's really hard to get the patients to come. So don't underplay that. Don't underthink the new patient flow. I will tell you, it's really hard to find practices for sale that have high new patient flows by default. But don't walk in just thinking, oh, I'm just going to throw out some Google ads or throw out some Facebook lives or TikToks or whatever it is, and all of a sudden I'm going to start getting patients in. It's not really how it works. Or at least it doesn't commonly work that way. So be prepared for that. I'd also say other things to really look out for in terms of when you're buying a dental practice is to, again, understand the marketing competition. So we talk about new patients. I'd also say look at the competition for marketing. Look at and see if there's any people that are advertising a lot in the area. Because if other people are advertising a lot in the area, then that points to market saturation. So that's something that is a parallel to the new patient numbers, is maybe the reason that that practice isn't getting new patients is because there's someone spending a giant amount of money on marketing in that demographic area. If that's the case, that means you're going to have to compete with them. And whatever money you throw at that problem likely won't do a whole lot, because the person who spends the most money for those avenues, for those marketing mediums, they're typically the ones that win. They're the ones that get the most eyeballs, and you got to be careful about it. So be paying attention to that. Other things to really look out for is pay attention to if you can find any bad reviews about the dental practice or any negative comments about the practice or anything like that on both Google reviews as well as on social media. And the reason is because unless you've done a really clean sweep of erasing the prior dental practice's footprint online, those reviews can still be found by people that are looking for your practice if they look up your practice in the wrong way. That can be a little tricky sometimes to make those things not show up whenever you're looking for those pieces of it. So as an example, if you Google, Jonathan Van Horn dental practice in, Arkansas or something like that, and I had taken over a practice at 123 Main Street, well, it would probably say my practice is the newest because I have the newest, website and all that other stuff. Because Google's smart, it's also possible that that address was linked to that old address. And like the very next thing is like 123 Main Street dentist, blasted on social media because A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Those things do affect people coming into your office. Fair or not, it does happen. Do us like an online view of what's happening with that practice, but when you're trying to buy it. So other things to look for. Surprisingly, we're having a lot of landlords right now be very picky about who they're letting buy businesses in their properties. We recently had a person come through that the landlord was requiring them to put in 6 figures as a deposit for them renting that property from them. I'm dumbfounded by it. I don't understand why. It was between $100,000 and $200,000 that this landlord was going to require this buyer of this dental practice to put into a security deposit for leasing a property. It's insanity. So surprisingly, that's happening more and more. We've had in the last 6 months, I can think of 2 or 3 acquisitions that would not go through specifically because of the landlord, not because of like the seller didn't want to sell it or the buyer didn't want to buy it or the value was too high or the bank wouldn't lend on it or anything like that. It was simply that the landlord didn't allow that person to buy that practice. That's something that's going to be farther on in the due diligence process. You're not going to be able to look at that on the surface level, but it is something to look out for and be aware of. And so be prepared for that. So I've talked a little bit about like what to really look for, and I've talked about some of the misconceptions about buying dental practices. Let's talk about something that people don't really talk about very often, and that is, what does failing look like when you're buying a dental practice? And this is something that is also just not very talked about very often, but there's failing in like running out of money, and there's failing of not reaching your earning potential based off of your industry. And in dentistry, the second is much more common than the first. The reason there's such a low failure rate for dental practices is not because they run out of money. It's because they just have this slow burn of like, they're making decent money, but they're not making what they could make. And acquiring a practice can happen more often than you think. So stats, the percentage of failures, they pretty much only count the first category. They don't typically look at the second category. The number one type of practice I find that I would say defines as a failure is people that buy really small producing dental practices that don't have a lot of patients. That seems to be the number one category of practices that fail. By the second category, not the first. So they may not run out of money. They may be making $50,000 to $100,000 a year, which is fine for a lot of people. But when I've talked to those clients in the past, that was not their intent. Or they wanted to build it to be a bigger practice or something like that. They looked at this practice, they're like, oh, well, the price tag's cheap. It's just as good as me doing a startup because I'm getting it for cheaper than what the startup was. But in reality, they're 5 or 6 years in at this point, and the practice was doing, say, $400,000 in revenue before, and now they're doing maybe $600,000, and it's taken them a long time to get to that point. And the reason is back to the prior category of talking about how spurring new patients in a practice that doesn't get very many new patients is really, really difficult to do well. So I would say in terms of failing, that's what really failing is in this industry. It's very rarely like you run out of money. And the reason is because if you think about it, you can do dentistry and you can do it fairly cost efficiently in most areas of the country, and you're going to inch out a profit one way or the other as long as you get just enough patients up through the door. So as an example of that, if everything went completely awful, you could shut everything down. You could have your rent. You could have maybe an assistant, maybe a front office person. You could do your own hygiene, and you could do the dental work yourself. That practice typically only needs somewhere around 50 to 80 patients a month coming through the doors to inch out, a $15,000 to $20,000 profit every month, right? That's possible with those number of patients coming through. So it's very doable. Being open 16 days a month with 80 patients coming through in a month, that's 5 patients a day, basically, right? That you're seeing through the whole practice. You could do the whole hygiene for them. You could do treatment plans, all those things, and you'd make some profit. But getting the active patients to come back is really, really difficult. That is the number one category of failures that I see in this industry is, again, someone buys a low producing practice with a low patient count, thinking that they can turn it around. That is the most common situation that I find that people have with failing. Other things in terms of failing is letting your debt get out of control, finding that you're spending too much money on all the new equipment, but not really generating more revenue with that new equipment because of all the new things that you're doing. Some people get caught in a trap of that and they make decent money, but they end up spending so much on all this new stuff without seeing any type of a revenue growth. They get kind of in a trap of like buying the newest thing and not being able to create profit. That also happens quite a bit, especially in practices that are not growing. Lastly, kind of in conclusion of what does failing look like, this is something that is almost never spoken about. And that is that not everybody gets into business and enjoys it. And not everybody enjoys the stress, mental fatigue that comes with owning a business. And that is something you got to really look internally to. So just speaking from personal experience here, we have 30, 35 team members at Tooth and Coin. And I take my responsibility to provide for the families of my team members very, very seriously. That's a weight that is carried by being a business owner. And whether you have 3 team members or you have 30 or 35 like I do, that weight is there with one or with a bunch. And not everybody can carry that weight. And so while you could construe that as a failure to say like, well, I didn't think of that until I got into it and then I couldn't handle that weight, there's no rules against tapping out. The great thing about dentistry is that you can typically sell the practice for fair value. You can typically get out of it if you need to. The thing that we seem to see happen more often is that if you aren't honest with yourself and say, hey, this isn't working out, and you don't just sell and then go work as an associate somewhere else, there is no shame in doing that either. Because again, being a business owner takes a weight on you. You go from taking care of patients to having the responsibility to take care of your team members, the patients, your community. You've got to be aware of like what's going on with social media in relation to your stuff. If you get a patient that comes through that gives you a bad review, all of a sudden your day is probably ruined. It's going to be a bad day. So you got to take care of it. And some people, the weight of that is not for them. So while I'm putting this in the category of what does failing look like, the only reason is because I don't feel like people talk about it enough. It is something that happens. Be aware of that possibility when you're looking to become a practice owner. In conclusion, I've talked a little bit about what some of the big misconceptions are about buying dental practices. I talked about what to really look for when you're looking to purchase a dental practice. I've talked about what does failing look like. Dentistry is one of the best industries to be in from being a business owner because you can really choose your own adventure when it comes to how you're going to do your business. In other words, there's a bunch of different paths you can take to be able to find success in this industry. while I said earlier that yes, acquiring a practice is the way to hit success by a traditional definition, which is maintaining profit, I do think that there are other ways to find success in this industry other than just buying a dental practice. You can be an awesome associate and make a really good living in this industry. Be an owner of a lifestyle dental practice and where you work a couple days a week and still make a couple $100,000 a year. You can have an associate driven practice where you have a really busy practice and other associates are doing it for you. And you maybe make less money than you would if you were doing the dentistry yourself, but you can get a pretty good lifestyle out of that. You can open up a bunch of different practices and be a successful multi-practice owner. You can be in a partnership with somebody and have you be the yin, they be the yang, and you be able to do really well with that. You can do so many different things in this industry and do a good job and find a fulfilling and happy career in business. It's an amazing industry to be in. So I'm obviously biased in the entrepreneurial elements of it. I think probably people that are listening to this are likely going to fall into that camp as well. But I did want to just put some of the pieces out there that are not really talked about when it comes to buying a dental practice. So until next time, this is Jonathan Van Horn. See you later. Thanks for listening to the Tooth and Coin podcast. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star review as well as a written review. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps other dental professionals find our podcast and benefit from the financial insights that we share. So thanks for your support, and we'll catch you in the next episode where we'll continue to explore the business side of dentistry.